Hello, and thank you for being with us again today. This is Dan Brook from Hudson, Wisconsin. I'm really delighted to be able to present another segment of our series called Conversations with Clergy. Those of you who watch us regularly know that we have concentrated so far with some Christian clergy, albeit a variety of them. The reason we're having conversations with clergy is because of the influence of religion in all the cultures of the world. That, again, it's one of the 5 major social institutions around which human needs are met. And so the press these days gives a lot of interest and excitement to some of the other social institutions, particularly economics and politics, but we just want to expand the horizons a little bit by sharing some conversations about religion and the leaders in religion. And this evening we're particularly pleased to have a representative of the Islamic faith, a young gentleman who is also an imam, meaning that he is a leader, kind of a professional leader in the worship activities of the Islamic faith. And so let me introduce to you with great pleasure Dr. Tamim Saidi, who happens to be a doctor of pharmacology, a pharmacologist, graduate of the University of Minnesota and originally from Afghanistan. We are delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be with you.
Now, why don't we start with a couple of questions just about personal interest.
Sure.
So you grew up in Afghanistan.
Yes.
You came here, you said at about 17. When you were a child, was the practice of the Islamic faith a really important part of your growing up years?
Absolutely it was. In our family it was, even though my dad was very religious, even though he was not at a level of what people consider to be like clergy level or what they call them the imams and so on. But we did our prayers on a regular basis. We did all 5 daily prayers. I remember waking up. My dad would wake us up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning for the morning prayers. I had to go to the mosque to learn how to read the Quran and understand the Quran every morning for the morning prayer. And then afterwards I would study with the imam at the mosque, and then would have some review lessons and books with my father and with my mother, who were religious but not over-religious, but was a really understanding of having an importance of the religion in our life. And by the way, maybe I should just add something quickly, saying that during that time, since the communist government was in charge of Afghanistan, they were really looking down on the people who are overtly practicing religion. And actually they had put a lot of people in jail for practicing religion. So for my family to still encourage us to be practicing Muslims in Afghanistan at that time, it was something extraordinary. Because there was quite a bit of, what they had considered, there was quite a bit of the people who were religious, they were against the communist government, against the government that they had there. So though I think it was extraordinary for us to actually, when we were going to high school even, for us to go pray in high school while we were in school there, it was something extraordinary.
So when you say communist, were those the years when Russia basically controlled the country?
Yep.
So it was imposed communism, it wasn't something...
No. It was imposed communism, but essentially the power was at the hands of the people who were assigned by the Russian and their government. It was what was called the People's Party and those groups of people. So they were in charge of, and they were really persecuting a lot of people who were Muslims at the time, even though the majority of people were Muslims. But they were not giving people freedom of religion. Even the mosque, which were the Afghanistan, as I'm sure you know, is about 99% Muslim. I think we have a very small Hindu minority. So even though the mosque, which were run in Afghanistan at the time, they were funded and organized, and the imams were assigned by the government. So they were telling them exactly what they should say, what they could not say, what they could do, what they could not do. So it was very much controlled practice of religion by the government at the time.
You know, I lived in Hungary, in part during the days of old state socialism, when the churches there also all the leadership in the church had to go through the Communist Party to get, so it was much the same
Very
sort
similar,
of a
right.
thing.
Yep, exactly.
So incidentally, to you, those of you who are watching, the world is about a quarter Muslim. And so it's, I don't know if it's maybe the second largest faith. And the history of it's very interesting. Maybe we'll get a little bit to that. Maybe we should right now by reminding our listeners that just as Christians have broken into all sorts of diverse sects, so have members of the Islamic faith, but the two major ones are Sunni and Shia.
Right.
And the same is true in Afghanistan. Are you and are most American Muslims Sunni or Shia or just a blend?
I think the majority of Muslims, well, worldwide and America, are majority Sunni. I think about 85%, 90% are Sunni, and about 15 to 20% are Shia, and that's very much true for in Minnesota, and I would assume in Wisconsin also. And Afghanistan is also, I think the majority is Sunni. I would imagine about, I don't think we have any exact numbers, but I would imagine about 80 to 90% would be Sunni, and then about the rest 20%, 15, 20% would be Shia Muslims. Whereas Iran and Iraq are two different, and they have a larger Shia populations, and Lebanon has, I think it's 50-50. The rest of the Muslim countries are mostly Sunni Muslims.
So does that mean, do Iraq and Iran kind of consider themselves minorities within the Muslim world?
I would think so, probably, yeah.
Maybe they do. Yeah. Anyway, in Minnesota, where you are most Sunni now,
Yes.
would you say?
Yep, the most Sunni.
But in the United States, I read someplace that the Shia and the Sunni, at least initially as more moved to the United States, cooperated quite well. Are they still cooperating generally?
They are, absolutely, yes. I think we have very good relationship between the Sunnis and the Shias within the United States. And I think that's very much true in most parts of the world, except certain areas which some kind of ethnic and religious conflicts come about, and and some people essentially fan the flames of those things and causes a lot of problems. But generally, I think Sunnis and Shias, for the most of parts of the history, they've gotten along very well together. Sure. And actually, they've been even intermarriages, families, neighbors, friends. Overall, has been very well, but with exceptions, of course. Just like it has been between Catholics and Protestants and so on throughout the history, the same is true for Muslims.
Can you give us just a kind of a thumbnail difference between the two? I mean, well, anyway.
Sure. Well, I think that the first thing to point out is that there's no theological difference between the Sunnis and the Shias. They still believe in the one God, the God of the universe, the God who created the universe, the God who created Adam and Eve to be the creator and the God to be worshipped. And they believe that Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet of God. Both of them believe in Prophet Muhammad as the last prophet. Both of them believe in the book of Quran as the last revelation from God. And then I guess what the difference is in how they might interpret certain parts of the Quran differently from the other part. So where the division came about is that, and even people on this have differed, where the division really came about is that during the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there was only one Islam. And he was the prophet. He was receiving revelation from God, telling people how to practice, what to do, what not to do. And then after he died, and Muslims believed that Prophet Muhammad was the last messenger of God, so there was going to be no new messengers coming after him. But just like Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, that he was also a prophet and also he was the head of the state, Prophet Muhammad was also not only a prophet, he was the head of the state. So now the Muslim community knew that there is going to be no new prophet, but they had to determine who should be the next head of the state. And then they had to find out, and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not very explicitly mention which person should be, although the Sunnis and the Shias have disagreed what he meant by certain actions that he did. The Sunnis would say that, well, when he was sick, when he was leading the prayer, he did not lead the prayer, and he appointed his close friend Abu Bakr to lead the prayer. So to the Sunnis, that signifies that he was indicating that after he is gone, he would want Abu Bakr to become the leader of the community. For the Shias, they would say that his cousin, which his name was Ali, they would say that when he had left his house in Mecca, when he had to actually essentially escape from Mecca, go to Medina, he had appointed him to stay in his bed and actually to appoint him with all the... And people, interestingly enough, at the time, even those people who did not believe him that he was the messenger of God, they had entrusted Prophet Muhammad with their properties and wealth and so on for him to keep. At the time, as you can imagine, they did not have safety deposit box and so on, so they would give it to somebody to keep for them. So when Prophet Muhammad escaped and he went to Medina, he appointed Ali to make sure that he actually returns all the people's property back to them. So that the Shia community, that signifies that he wanted Ali to become the head of the state, and the Shia community believed that the leadership should be from the family of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Where the majority of the Sunnis believe that, the inheritance and hereditary genetics does not have as much to do with leadership, but that the community should get together and decide who is the most apt and most has the highest ability to be the head of the state. And at that time, by the way, when Prophet Muhammad died, peace be upon him, Ali, Muslims say, radiyallahu anhu, may God be pleased with him, he was about 30 years old, and his friend Abu Bakr was in his 60s. And they had to decide to say who should be the head of the state. And then they essentially decided that Abu Bakr would become the head of the state. But there was a very strong group of people, they wanted the leadership to stay within the family of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And they were called the Shia Ali, which meant the group of Ali. And that's where the word Shia comes from. And then Abu Bakr becomes the head of the state, and he is the ruler for about 3 years or so, then he dies. And then again, the community had to decide who should be the next head of the state. And then the community picks the second person, who was Umar, may God be pleased with him. He becomes the head of the state. He's the leader for about 10 years or so. And then he dies, and then the community again had to decide. They had to do some polling and voting and things within themselves, what they could do. And then Uthman becomes the next head of the state. And then finally, Ali does become the head of the state. But nonetheless, the division comes from is that, the division that had come right after the death of Prophet, peace be upon him, or about 40 years or so, 30, 40 years later after his death, when actually Ali became the head of the state. And they had a lot of turmoils in the community at the time. They had many wars and civil strifes and so on. And then finally, Ali also, in a war, he gets killed and he becomes a martyr. So, and also then, the division kind of grows between the two communities. They legislate differently, they interpret differently, they exegete the Quran differently, and as generation has gone by, I think that they have done things differently for a long time, so there is the difference seems larger. Even though in the beginning, all the people who were actually the basis, the people, the founders of the religion, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and this strong group who was right next to them, they all had the same beliefs and the same practices. But then later on, actually kind of changed throughout. So essentially is that the difference is not theological difference, it became more of a political difference.
Two quick questions. When you talk about head of state, what state are we talking about?
This was at a time in the Mecca and Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Saudi Arabia, that was.
Okay. Now, at this stage, does each arm of the Islamic faith have a different leader?
No, at that point they all had the one leader. They agreed.
But right now?
Well, I think the Shias, they do have a more of a structural basis, like the Catholic Church has a more of structural basis, whereas the Sunni community does not have a structural, they does not have a hierarchy. Each community has their own imams and their own leaders, and they have the scholars that they respect, but there is not one leadership for the entire Sunni population. Whereas I think within the Shia population, they have a more of a hierarchical status among their scholars and about their imams.
Now, practicing as an imam, what kind of training, if any, do you need to have to do that? Or is it just that people who you worship with have said, here's a young man who lives the right kind of lifestyle, he's well-spoken, or is that how it goes, or do they require special training for it?
It's not required that somebody has to have that training, but it's always helpful to have that. Basically, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, had said, Prophet Muhammad said that whenever you have a group of 3 people, appoint somebody as the imam or the leader of that group. And they would say that, they would try to appoint somebody who is a righteous person, who has more knowledge of the religion, who has the more knowledge of the book of God, the last revelation from God, the Quran. They knows how to do the prayers, what to do if they make a mistake or something happens about those things. So they would pick somebody who is the best in those areas as the imam or as the leader for the group. Nonetheless, nowadays there's actually some universities and so on that they would provide degrees for the people. But as long as, traditionally the idea is that as long as you know how to do the prayers, you can perform the prayers, you understand the Quran, you can understand how to work with the community, that is good enough. So it's not, there's no structural way that was passed on from Prophet Muhammad that you have to pass this degree before you're able to be an imam. But not, nowadays, I think it's a good thing that a lot of young people can go to these schools and they can get a certificate that they are imams and they have understood those things.
Where would a school like that be?
We actually have a couple in Minnesota. We have one actual physical called the Islamic University of Minnesota. There are a couple of online, at least one online university that the people are here in Minnesota. I'm sure Wisconsin has some. The other parts of other states have some in America and the U.S. also. California has a few. I'm sure New York has a few. Chicago has a few. Larger cities have a larger one. So, but now it's online. It can be anywhere.
Everything's online.
And everything is online nowadays. So.
To back up a little bit, so when you were 17. And your family decided to leave, where did you go? When did you land in the United States? And how much of a culture shock was it?
Interesting question. By the way, my family still stayed in Afghanistan.
Oh, they did?
I had to escape by myself with a group that came, that my father knew some people that would smuggle me out, essentially. So they had to smuggle me out to Pakistan, which took us, it was like a long journey that I had to go through the mountains and at nights and so on, which normally would take about, I think now when you drive from Kabul to Peshawar, it's about 7-8 hours, but it took us a long, few days to get from Peshawar to from Kabul to Peshawar, and then we had to dodge all the Russians soldiers and all the government soldiers and so on, not to get caught, and then we finally made it to Pakistan. So I lived in Pakistan with a family which was very generous for me to let me stay with them, one of our distant relatives. I stayed with them for a while, and then first we were in Peshawar, which is a city the province closest to Afghanistan. Then we moved to Islamabad, which is the capital. So in Islamabad, in Peshawar, they spoke Pashto, which mostly we could understand and speak Pashto. Then in Islamabad, the majority of people spoke Urdu, but most people knew English. So I knew some English from back home because my father had forced me to learn some English back there, so I could communicate some with the people and whatever broken English I had at the time. So that was helpful as well.
So your father really did a loving act. I mean, he really wanted the best for you.
Absolutely.
Do you have siblings back in Afghanistan still?
My sister actually just came to the U.S. about a year ago or so.
Really?
She was in Afghanistan. She was actually in Pakistan, and then things got better. They moved to Afghanistan, and then she finally came here about a year ago after a long waiting period. So now my side of the family, my parents actually came here, I think about 10 years ago or so. My father died here, I think about 6-7 years ago. My mother is living with us, and my sister came back. So I do still have some family in Afghanistan. My uncle is living there, my cousins are living there. My wife's entire family is in Kabul right now. And sometimes it's worrisome because of everything we hear, all the indiscriminate violence that happens there. It's very sad and it's very worrisome.
So how did you meet your wife?
Through family.
Through family.
Through family. What happened was that actually I went back when I finished my college degree and I was looking to get married. My parents said, well, why don't you come here? They were living in Pakistan at the time. They said, well, we know some good families, some good people that you should look into and see if he can get, if you would like anyone, he could get married. So I said, oh, I'll come and visit, but I will not make any promises. So I actually went there, and then at the first trip, I could not make any decisions. So I came back after about a year or so. Then I went back, and then I met a couple families. I met my wife. And they told me a lot. They had done a lot of research for me, which was a really wonderful thing. And my sister had done a lot of research. I could trust, of course, her, my mother, my father. I knew that they had my best intention at heart and what they were looking for, and they had given me some choices. I went and met my wife, and we talked to them. We talked in private for a while, discussed some of the issues, and then we agreed that we would marry. Actually, we gave some time, and then we decided to get married. So I usually tell people is that my marriage was semi-arranged marriage, not really arranged marriage, but something that we had an option to say yes or no. Because a lot of people, when they hear the word of arranged marriage, they equate it with a forced marriage, which in some cases it might be the case, but definitely was not in our case. I wanted to make sure that my family knew that I had the final veto power, and that my wife or my future wife could have always said, no, I don't want to marry this person. Which was, but we have been married for the past 13 years, and I'm really grateful to God, as we say, mashallah, by the will of God. We've been very happy, and I really feel eternally indebted to my family for helping me find my wife. Because I know sometimes it's challenging, but I think at that time, I'm sure even now, their network was bigger than my network. They had more credence in the community than I had, so it was very helpful for them to help me out, try to find my future mate.
Now, the not arranged, but sort of semi-arranged marriage, is that more of a cultural thing, and or if so, does religion play any part in it?
Well, actually, religion says, I mean, we talked about forced marriages. Religion actually specifically forbids forced marriages. Actually, there's a time from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that it's required for both husband and wife to consent to get married. If one of them does not have consent, that is not a valid marriage. And there's actually a very nice, interesting incident during his time. There was a girl who was forced by his father to get married to this man. And then after the next day, she came back to the Prophet, said, "Oh, Messenger of God, my father forced me to marry this man. So what is the ruling on this?" He said, "Well, your marriage is, if you don't want to be married, your marriage is nullified, it's void. You don't have to be married to her." But she said, "Well, I actually happen to like this guy, but I just want to make sure to find out what was the ruling on it." Which is really interesting, because I'm sure there will be some cases that the families would force people to get married to someone, but religiously that is considered to be a forbidden. It's not permissible to do that. But nonetheless, I mean, it's part of the cultures that the parents would help their children to find the right mate that they see fit and so on. But really should not be a forced marriage.
So to back up a little bit again, how did you get from Pakistan to the USA, and how would you sort of describe the culture shock?
Well, at the time, I mean, I was so young that I couldn't realize, but I knew some people who came to the U.S. and I realized it was not the official visa way, but they said, I met this person and said, "Oh, if you give me so much money, and I'll get you a ticket and a passport to go to America." And I'm, as naive as I was as a teenager, I said, "Sounds like a good idea." So so I found some money actually with the help of some relatives, some really generous relatives who really helped me. And this person was, interestingly enough, thank God, was an honest person who actually brought me up to the U.S. But when I came here, I realized that I was not a legal visa. So then I had to go back and tell them this is what had happened, and I had to say that I had come with this. So basically I came as an asylum, seeking asylum to the U.S., as a refugee to the U.S. And I came here, applied for a permanent green card and so on. Then I was a permanent resident for a few years, and then I became a citizen.
Here in Minneapolis?
Minneapolis.
So you came directly from Pakistan to Minneapolis. Yes. And why did you choose Minneapolis?
Because I had my aunt and uncle here.
Oh.
My uncle had come here, come to Minnesota, I think in early 70s. And actually he came here because his uncle came here in Minnesota in the 60s. So I came here because I had family here. I had my aunt and my uncle and when his wife were living here, and my aunt when her husband were living here. So I had family here, so that's why I came here. And I've loved Minnesota so far. It does. Occasionally the winters are challenging, as it is here in Wisconsin, I'm sure, but people are wonderful people. The opportunities are great. Job situation is good. Schools are great. So I've been loving it here. So this is essentially home for me for the past 23 years.
Wow. And your kids?
We have twins who are 8.5 years old, and we have a younger son who is almost 7.
Wow.
So yes, and they're in school. They're going in 3rd grade and a 2nd grade.
That's great.
Keeping us busy.
Does your spouse work outside the home?
No, not yet.
Yes.
Not yet. She was actually taking some classes, but she's putting that on hold until the kids grow up a little bit, and then we can focus on that again.
Good for her. Here's a nosy question. To somebody like myself, who has lived in quite a few different cultures, I try to determine whether or not I can look at a person and be fairly accurate in terms of what part of the world they come from. Now, when you said you lived in Pakistan, to me, who knows very little, unfortunately, about that region of the world, you could be Pakistani as far as I'm concerned. Is there a lot of difference, sort of, in the history between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or are you interrelated since your borders?
I think we are definitely interrelated. I'm sure. Obviously, there was a time that this whole region was one nation, one country, and then eventually became divided and so on. But there's definitely people who are blood relations across the borders. So specifically the border which is currently between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That was a border which was drawn between when the British left, and they had to draw a line between what used to be India at a time and Afghanistan. After they were actually defeated in Afghanistan, I think 3 times. Then they finally came and signed a pact saying that, well, this is the a new line, new border, and then we're gonna make a peace treaty, and it's supposed to be, which is temporary at that time, but it's been staying there. So yeah, definitely people are related, and people look very similar to each other. But nonetheless, cultures are different, and even I'm sure, if you were to go from Wisconsin to Texas, the cultures will be different. If you go from Texas to New York, the culture will be different, and that's also true between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Things were at least done differently in Kabul, where I lived, versus in Peshawar, where I started visiting people, versus Islamabad was different. And also the things, so I had a culture shock actually going from Kabul to Peshawar to Islamabad, and I also had a culture shock coming to America. But I think it was eased a little bit because I had family here. They actually kind of explained things to me. They walked me through. They drove me around, explained things to me. So, and I was expecting the differences. Obviously, I watched a lot of movies about America when I was a kid, and even in Pakistan. So that helped. But nonetheless, having family here was great because they could explain things to me. I could go always ask them questions. And I remember in my high school when I went here, I had the same homeroom as a lot of foreign exchange students. And some of the students were coming from France and Germany and some of the European countries, and even seemed like they had a bigger culture shock than I had, because they were very new here, and I was actually with my family and so on, and they were helping me with a lot of things. So
when you came, did you have to take a couple of years in high school to?
Yes, it was yeah.
What grade did they put you in?
I came here, I was 17 years old, so they put me in senior year.
Oh, they did. And was it easy to, was the education you had in Afghanistan about at the same level as in the US of A?
My challenge was English, of course. Because I would usually, after school, I would go home and study. I would looking up the dictionary until like 11, 12 o'clock at night.
Really?
Keep on looking up the words and everything, what the words are, what they mean. I could do math, I could understand science. Math was very simple because it was just numbers. It was easy to understand. I could do science. I learned computers pretty quickly. But the challenge was English for a while until I learned how to speak English and understand the vocabulary and so on.
What turned you on to pharmacology?
Well, of course, I was thinking about medical school, even when I was in Afghanistan, and I came here for that. So I was thinking about maybe a couple of years of, finishing a Bachelor of Science in pharmacy and then applying for medical school. And then when I came to pharmacy school, I realized how much I can do as a pharmacist. And then I realized that I could actually do a doctor of pharmacy degree and not only a bachelor's in pharmacy. And then I also realized that, well, my parents were still in Pakistan as refugees. Even while I was in school, I had to send them some money over there to help them out financially. Then I thought to myself, I said, well, maybe I don't want to be in school for another 12 more years after this, because it would have been at least 4 years of medical school, maybe 3 to 4 years, extra years, and residencies and so on. Then I thought that it's probably good to stop somewhere here instead of continuing too long so I can help out my family to come. So that was the
and you liked the decision?
I did, yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, we've really gone kind of far astream, but it's always interesting to learn about the person, because in learning about the person, you learn a lot about other things that are connected. And in this case, we're all pretty, with great regret, ignorant not only about Afghanistan and that region of the world, but also about the faith that you practice.
You're absolutely right, because there's some polls that had done nationally and locally that say that 65 to 70% of Americans admit to not knowing anything or not knowing much about Islam and Muslims. So that's very true.
So what are the 2 things you would most like us to know about the faith you practice?
I guess the first thing would be is that the Muslim community in America, in Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and internationally, I guess one thing that can be said about them is it's not a monolithic community. It's a very diverse community in every aspect. And depending on how conservative or liberal they are, how practicing, non-practicing they are, where they fall in all those things, they're clearly not a monolithic community. So you cannot say, well, Muslims are like this. Even some of them sort of dismay of the Muslims, because we would like all the Muslims to be good Muslims and following certain things and not following certain things. But clearly the reality is that it's not a monolithic community. The second thing would be is that to understand that Muslims believe that Islam is the last revelation that the God of universe sent to the last prophet. The same God who sent revelations to Abraham, peace be upon him, also to Noah, peace be upon him, to Moses, peace be upon him, to Jesus, peace be upon him, sent the last revelation to the humanity through the last prophet called Muhammad, peace be upon him, which he lived in Arabia, but that revelation was not only for the Arabs in that time, but he sent the last revelation to the humanity from that point on until the day of judgment. So Muslims believe the same God who has been sending, the one God of the universe. Of course, Muslims believe in the one God, a very monotheistic, Abrahamic religion. This is the last revelation from the God of the universe, who has been sending revelation throughout, just the last prophet. Certain rules, actually, if you really look into it, a lot of the rules in the Quran are very similar to the rules in the Torah and the Old Testament and the Bible. But there are certain things which are different, of course, which Muslims would say that it's because of how things have changed nowadays than it was in the 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years BC. But nonetheless, Muslims believe it's the same. The one God of the universe has sent the last revelation to the humanity.
So that's one thing. What would be a second thing we should all know about your faith?
I think something which would be probably interesting for your audience would be is that whenever I do presentation for the churches and talk to my Christian friends and go to the different churches and even synagogues, people tell me is that after they realize, understand Islam, is that we have so much more in common than we differ on. The similarities, they actually, one of the congregants told me in one of the churches that he said, he actually said, I felt like our religion was about this far apart, but now I think we are this close. Yeah. Which I think it's really, really true. A lot of times I think people focus a lot on the differences and we forget how much we have in common. And I have talked to people, they have told me is that we have 95% in common and there's 5% that we differ on. Which I think is very true. We have a lot more in common. Muslims have a lot more in common with Jews and Christians than a lot of people know how much we have in commonality. We are actually part of an interfaith dialogue on a monthly basis at the Islamic Center in Fridley. By the way, if anybody's interested, it's on a third Sunday of every month, basically when the school is in session, not in the summer. And it's from 2 to 4 o'clock. We talk about different topics. And what we have come to realize is that we have so much in common, it's just incredible. But nonetheless, we do have some differences, which is the differences are significant for the Muslims as they are for Christians. But nonetheless, I think we have a lot more in common than we differ on. And I think it will serve us and serve the humanity well if we start focusing on the similarities rather than the differences. And of course, not ignoring, not disregarding differences, but nonetheless realizing how much we have in common. I think that will be very helpful.
Well, and I'm delighted to hear you say that. I also agree. We have a little group that has a program on this same station where we have a Muslim, a Christian, and a Jew talk about various things. And we almost break out in joy every time because it's hard to find things we disagree with.
On, right?
We do on some, but to have learned a lot about each other just makes life so much more interesting. And our God, regardless of how we define that God, must be very happy to see God's children.
And Muslims would say that we have so much in common because the source of our revelation is the same God. It's coming from the same God. That's why we have so much in common.
I'm going to ask you just a little bit of a tough question because I have a feeling some people might like to know this. Just as Christians have extremes, and in fact, for the Christian community, it's probably not unlike the Islamic community or the Muslim community that practices Islam, in that we have maybe about 20% who are very, very conservative, almost antagonistic to the basic doctrines of the Christian faith without knowing they do so. I presume much is the same for you and the so-called in Afghanistan, the Taliban, or maybe less the Taliban than others, but the ones who are in conflict, get all the bad press, are surely a minority, but are they predominantly Shia or Sunni, or does that not make any difference at all?
I don't think that makes a difference. I mean, I'm sure there are some extremists among the Sunnis and they are among the Shias as they are among Catholics and Protestants. I think they're in both. But nonetheless, I think something which will be interesting is that if you were to look at about 2 billion Christian population around the world and 1.7 billion Muslims around the world, we are very much mirror images of each communities. We have the extremists on each side. We even have the terrorists on each side. We have the very kind and compassionate people on each side. So we have mirror images of people on each side of those things. So I mean, you know, of course, just like with the Christian community, there are some, you know, some people who have committed terrorism in the name of Christianity. There are Muslims who have committed terrorism in the name of Islam. And of course, the majority of Muslims have condemned that, but sometimes that does not make it to the in the mainstream media that this is what's happening, because I'm sure you would know that normalcy does not make it the news, right? If you're normal and common things are happening, that's not the news. Something, whenever there's something odd's happening, that makes it the news, and that's usually sticks in minds of the people. With those images, it's hard to get those off. Doesn't matter how many millions of people work towards peace and towards understanding. But nonetheless, you know, unfortunately, there are some extremists, and it's really hard to control on each side. It takes a while, it takes time. Hopefully will be diminished as much as possible.
We live in hope. One final question with regard to that, the term jihad, which is hideously misused. Would you mind clarifying for us a little bit the actual meaning of the word? And
yeah, absolutely. Jihad, actually, it's, a lot of times you probably have noticed is that it's translated as a holy war. The phrase holy war does not exist in Islamic dictionary. It does not exist in the Quran. It does not exist in the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And war is never considered to be holy in Islam. Actually, in the Quran calls a war to be the last resort. If you are being forced or being attacked by your enemies and your back is completely against the wall, and then you have the right to go and defend yourself. Otherwise, you should always aim for peace. You should always try to win your enemy over as much as possible. So nonetheless, Islam allows Muslims to have a defensive war to defend themselves, but not to go kill innocent people. So what jihad means is, jihad means to struggle, to strive, to work hard for the sake of God. And actually specifically said by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and also in the Quran also. We just had some fundraisers, and I remind people about that. When you give your money for the sake of God, to help people, to build an orphanage, to build a library, to build a school, to build a mosque or a church, you're doing it for the sake of God, you are making jihad. You're struggling, striving against your own self, because your innate nature would be to hang on to the money for yourself, for selfish reasons. When you give it up, when you struggle against yourself, that is considered to be jihad. Prophet Muhammad also said that when a woman is giving birth, she's making jihad. When you're raising your children and when a difficulty, and I can tell you about raising twins at the same time, you know, not sleeping very much, that is clearly jihad. That's clearly struggle on the way of God. Try to raise good children and doing well. So that is what jihad is. But nonetheless, Muslims are allowed to defend themselves. But the Quran specifically and sayings of Prophet Muhammad specifically forbids killing of innocent people. The people who are not attacking you. You're not allowed to kill them. Actually, the chapter 5 verse 32 in the Quran says that if you were to kill one innocent person, it's like you have killed the entire humanity. If you were to save one innocent person, it's like you have saved the life of the entire humanity. And Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that if you were to kill a sparrow unjustifiably, meaning that you're not hunting to feed yourself for family or someone, but just for fun, you'll be responsible in front of God on the day of judgment for a sparrow, let alone anything bigger, let alone a human unjustifiably. So I think Islamic teaching is very clear on these regards. But nonetheless, there are some people who would deviate from the Islamic teachings. I'm sure as there are people of other faiths who would do the same thing.
It's been just a total delight to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Please apologize to your spouse for keeping you from those 3 children
No problem.
during dinner time. And we wish you a safe journey home, and I hope our paths cross again.
Absolutely, we'll hope to do this.
The conversation we have had has been very informative for me, and I'm sure it is for our viewers too. And we're most grateful for you, for your presence in the community, and for this conversation.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. God go with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. Good night now.